Elias Vaughn had served in operations that did not exist, for a government that would later deny he existed too. He learned that lesson standing at attention in a room with no windows, listening to a colonel read his own death sentence off a tablet in a voice that never once rose above procedure. His continued existence, the colonel explained, now presented political exposure. 12 years of black file operations had a way of doing that to a man. The colonel did not call it a betrayal. He called it reclassification. Effective immediately, Elias Vaughn would be listed as a border contaminant, stripped from every registry that had ever recorded his service, his blood type, his next of kin. Officially, he had already died during an off-world containment recovery 8 months prior. The paperwork had been filed before the meeting started. Elias asked only one question. "Do you remember her name?" The colonel did not answer because the colonel had never needed to know it, and that silence told Elias everything the 12 restricted operations under conditional medical incentive never had. He had traded years of his life and pieces of his conscience for a promise that his daughter's medical care would be covered for as long as he served. Conditional, the colonel said when Elias raised it, not guaranteed. Grief makes people hear promises where there are only terms. Elias did not argue. Men who argued with the directorate did not get offered a chair on the way out. They got offered a drop pod and a designation, biological surface test, non-essential personnel, expendable. If you survive, the mission brief read, we will know the surface can take us. Nobody had bothered to specify who they meant by we. He thought of his daughter twice on the ride to the launch platform, twice more strapped into a pod barely large enough to hold a coffin, and one final time as the outer hatch sealed, and the last transmission he would ever receive from anyone who knew his real name crackled through a dying comm line. "Dad, are you coming home?" He had no answer for her then, and the universe did not wait for one. Atmospheric integrity failed within 90 seconds of entry. Trajectory went unstable at 11,000 meters. He remembers the restraints tearing at his shoulder, remembers a mechanical voice reciting life support failure imminent with the same flat calm the colonel had used to erase him, remembers thinking that dying inside a falling coffin was at least an honest way for the directorate to finish the sentence it had started in that windowless room. He did not die. The forest caught him instead, and the forest was not gentle about it. The world he woke into had no mercy in its architecture, and no patience for men who moved carelessly through it. He learned this within his first conscious hour, half-blind with pain, dragging himself between roots the width of highway pylons, while something with too many legs and no interest in negotiation tracked him by scent. He learned it a second time from a voice he could not yet place a face to, low and certain, cutting through his panic with instructions that assumed he was capable of following them. "Do not follow the color, follow the motion. Pretty things still bite. The forest does not hate you, but it will not forgive carelessness." He asked, half delirious, why a forest that did not hate him kept trying to kill him. The answer came back without hesitation, the way only a truth repeated 1,000 times before ever needed to. Because we are not above it, we live with it, we listen. We take only what we can carry back. Fear makes the hand tight, and a tight hand moves late. He learned that lesson written across his own body before the sun set. Twice more routes reached for him. Twice more voices he could not see barked commands he only half understood. And once, kneeling in mud with his own blood running warm down his forearm, he heard a child's voice ask what the sky had dropped on them this time. "Bad landing," he managed to say. And somewhere behind him, laughter rippled through people who had every reason not to laugh at a stranger from the sky bleeding out in their territory. It would take him longer than that first day to understand why they let him live at all. It would take him the rest of his life to understand why they chose, again and again, to keep choosing it. The Black Files did not remember his daughter's name, but Elias did. In the specific way a man remembers the one thing he built his entire compromised life around protecting. She had been 3 years old when the first illness took hold, a rare degenerative condition that the family insurance on a border world salary could never have covered, and the directorate recruiter who found him in a hospital waiting room understood exactly what kind of leverage grief made. He signed the contract without reading past the medical guarantee clause. He would spend the next 12 years telling himself that made the rest of it forgive. Abel, it did not, and some nights, in the months before the colonel read his death sentence aloud, he had almost admitted that to himself out loud. He thought of her face more than he thought of his own survival during the descent, which was perhaps why he survived it at all. Men who fought only for themselves tended to freeze at the moment. Their bodies told them it was over. Elias had spent 12 years training his body to keep functioning past that moment for reasons that had nothing to do with himself. And the habit did not abandon him, even when the reason for it was a border away and unreachable. He remembered flashes rather than a continuous sequence. The restraint tearing free from his shoulder socket, the sudden absence of gravity as the pod's stabilizers failed entirely, a green blur rushing up faster than any simulation had ever prepared him for, and then nothing, for a length of time he would never be able to account for. When awareness returned, it returned in pieces. The taste of blood, the particular, undeniable smell of a forest floor, rich and rotting and alive in a way no starship interior had ever smelled. A weight across his chest that turned out to be a shard of the pod's hull, and beneath that, worse, the growing certainty that whatever had tracked him by scent in that first disoriented hour was not going to lose interest simply because he wanted it to. He had faced worse odds in 12 years of operations that officially never happened. He had simply never faced them completely alone, without extraction, without backup, without a single soul on this world who had any reason to want him to survive the night. That would change faster than he expected, and slower than he needed it to, and somewhere in between those two truths, Elias Vaughn began, without fully realizing it yet, the long process of becoming someone the directorate had never trained him to be. There was a particular kind of silence the directorate specialized in. One Elias had grown so used to over 12 years that he had stopped noticing it as strange, until the moment it was finally turned against him personally. It was the silence of paperwork moving faster than conscience, of decisions made in rooms he had never been permitted to enter about a life he had spent entirely in service of an organization that would not so much as confirm his existence if asked. He had watched that silence swallow other men before him, operators who had served past the point of usefulness and simply stopped appearing on rosters one day, their names never mentioned again by anyone who had once called them brothers in arms. He had told himself, each time, that his case would be different, because his daughter's care depended on it, because the contract had a clause, because 12 years of loyalty had to count for something in an organization that measured everything else in ledgers. He understood now, standing in that windowless room, that loyalty had never been the currency he thought it was. It had only ever been leverage, and leverage expired the moment it stopped being useful to the people holding it. He had trained for combat drops his entire career, and none of that training had prepared him for waking alone on a world with no extraction plan and no chain of command left to answer to. There was a strange, disorienting freedom buried inside that terror, one he would not recognize as freedom until much later. For the first time in 12 years, no order was coming. No mission brief would arrive to tell him what his survival was worth to anyone else. Whatever he did next, he would do it because he chose to, not because a colonel in a windowless room had decided his life still had marginal utility. It was a small, bitter kind of gift, wrapped in the worst days of his life, and he would spend a long time afterward learning how to actually hold it. They carried him rather than let him walk, and Elias was in no condition to argue with that either. The village that received him did not look like the primitive scattering of huts the directorate's survey brief had prepared him to expect. It grew out of the root structure itself, chambers hollowed beneath the canopy, where the mother root thickened into walls, pathways woven from living fiber that bent to accommodate footsteps and straightened again after. He would later learn the settlement had no formal name in any language his translator implants could parse. Its people simply called it home, the same word they used for the forest itself, as if there had never been a meaningful line between the two. The elders convened before he was fully conscious, and their verdict arrived the way verdicts did in a society that had survived this long by never rushing toward mercy. "He lives until the elders speak," one of them said, and for 2 days that was the entire shape of his existence. Alive, provisionally, pending a decision made by people who owed him nothing. He would learn later how close that decision had come to going the other way. A boy had died protecting the youngest of the settlement's children from a hunting swarm the sky had stirred loose during the crash, and half the settlement had wanted the sky-blooded stranger who caused it thrown back to the forest he fell out of. It was Habara, the settlement's healer and the elder who had come to matter more to Elias than almost anyone left alive, who argued otherwise. He stood before them, she said. He bled. They followed, and then he bled more. He pushed the danger away. He was in front of the children when it mattered, not behind them. "One good moment is not safety," another elder answered, and nobody in that chamber disagreed with her either. So the terms were set with a precision that told Elias exactly how seriously this civilization took the business of trust. No weapons, no route paths without an escort, no children left alone with him under any circumstance. Heal him, watch him, and if he proved himself only capable of bleeding for people once and returning to what he was after, the forest would take him back on its own terms. He spent the following weeks earning the right to be disbelieved a little less. Habara treated the worst of his wounds with a bitter sap that closed shallow cuts and did nothing for the deep ones, explaining between applications that the same compound that saved him could kill the predators that circled the healing chamber at night, because it hated what burned its senses as much as any infection did. He learned slowly the outline of a philosophy he had never once encountered in 12 years of black operations. That kindness could exist at a careful distance from trust, that the two were not the same thing and did not need to pretend to be. "Were you sent to hurt us?" Habara asked him once, with no anger in the question, only the need to know. "No," he told her. "I was sent to die." "By your own people," she said, and it was not really a question either. "They stopped being mine before they sent me," he answered, and meant it more than he expected to. It was the children who broke him open faster than any elder's judgment could. They found him fascinating in the specific, merciless way children find anything strange fascinating, and they asked him questions with no diplomatic padding whatsoever. "Did the sky drop you? Why do you walk broken? Is it cold above the trees? Why are your ears round? Why is your clothing so ugly?" He answered as honestly as he could manage. Bad landing, bad supply, very. They came that way. And somewhere in the exchange of a dozen small, absurd questions, he found himself laughing for what felt like the first time in years, at a joke made by a child who wanted to know if all sky people were as angry as he looked. "No," he told her, "but angry people like uniforms." He carried a charm on him still, a small worn thing that had survived the crash pinned inside his jacket, and when one of the children asked what it was, he almost lied. "A memory," he said instead, and did not explain further, because some things he was not yet ready to say out loud to strangers, even strangers who had saved his life and were slowly, carefully, deciding whether to trust it with more than that. Habara's teaching, he came to realize, was never really about herbs or sap or the particular geometry of a wound. It was about a way of seeing the world that his entire life had trained him out of. "Every predator has a season," she told him once, kneeling beside him as she reset a splint made from woven root fiber. "Every plant has an hour it will not forgive you for disturbing. You do not fight the forest. You learn its calendar and it stops treating you as an intruder and starts treating you as weather." He asked her, half joking, whether that meant the forest would eventually stop trying to kill him. She did not laugh. "It means," she said, "that eventually it will kill you for reasons that make sense, instead of reasons that don't," and there was no arguing with the strange, hard comfort in that answer. The children gave him a name of their own within the first month, something in their own tongue that his translator rendered loosely as the one who fell wrong, and he wore it without complaint, because it was more honest than any rank he had ever carried. A girl named Avigara, barely older than his own daughter, took it upon herself to correct his pronunciation of every word he mangled, with the ruthless patience only children extend to adults they have decided are worth the effort. It was her class he had shielded during the first hunting swarm, the reason half the elders had been willing to argue for his life at all, though neither of them spoke of it directly. She simply appeared at his side most mornings, unbothered by the guards still technically assigned to watch him, and narrated the forest to him in the specific, unhurried way children narrate things they have never had to learn twice. Not everyone extended him the same grace. A hunter named Doran, who had lost a brother to a border skirmish with Sky forces decades before Elias had ever set foot on this world, watched him with an open, unhidden distrust that never fully thawed, not in those early weeks and not for a long time after. Doran did not threaten him. He simply made his disapproval a fixture of every gathering, every meal, every moment Elias was permitted closer to the settlement's center than the outer chambers. Habara never asked Doran to soften, and never let his coldness dictate the terms of Elias' presence either. Trust is not owed, she told Elias once when he asked why she tolerated the tension. It is earned in installments, and Doran's installments will simply be slower than most. He found, in time, that he respected that more than he resented it. A civilization that trusted too easily would not have survived long enough to be worth joining. He began, eventually, to contribute something beyond his own survival to the settlement's daily rhythm, in the small, unglamorous ways that trust is usually built rather than declared. He had no skill with root fiber or healing sap, but he understood structure, load, the particular physics of things built to withstand pressure. Knowledge 12 years of black operations had given him for entirely different reasons than the ones it now served. He helped reinforce a collapsing chamber wall that had worried the settlement's builders for a full season before he arrived, using nothing but an outside eye and a soldier's instinct for where weight actually traveled through a structure, rather than where it was assumed to. It was a small thing, in the scale of everything the settlement had already given him, but it was the first time since the crash that he had given something back without being asked, and Habara noticed, the way she noticed most things, without comment, filing it away into whatever quiet ledger she kept of a man slowly becoming someone worth the risk her people had taken on him. There were nights in those early weeks when the weight of everything he had lost caught up with him regardless of how much daylight progress he had made toward earning his place. He would wake in the healing chamber certain, for a disoriented moment, that he was still strapped into the failing pod, or worse, still standing in the windowless room listening to his own erasure read aloud in a voice that never once acknowledged it was ending a life. Habara found him during one of these nights, sitting alone near the chamber's entrance, and did not ask what troubled him, because she had tended enough grief in her long life to know that some wounds needed silence more than questions. She sat with him instead, saying nothing for a long while, until finally she told him something that stayed with him longer than almost anything else she ever said. Grief that has nowhere to go becomes a wound that never closes, she said. Grief that is given somewhere to go becomes a root. It still hurts, but it holds something up. He did not fully understand what she meant that night. He would understand it completely, months later, standing at the edge of a grave dug for a boy who had died protecting children that were not his own. By the time the second sky vessel finally landed beyond the outer marsh, Elias had stopped thinking of himself as a stranger waiting for permission to belong, and started thinking of himself as someone with something worth defending on both sides of that tree line. It was a shift so gradual he could not point to the single day it happened, only recognize, looking back, that it had happened long before he was ready to admit it out loud to anyone, including himself. The second vessel landed beyond the outer marsh 11 days after he did, and Elias knew what it meant before anyone told him. A ship that came armed and quiet was not a rescue. It was a retrieval, and retrievals only ever came for two things: assets or evidence. He insisted on meeting it himself, over Habara's objection and the flat refusal of two of the settlement's hunters who did not trust a second wave of sky people any more than they had trusted the first. Sky calls to sky, he told them, not entirely sure it was true, only sure that if his old unit found the settlement without him standing between them, the outcome would be worse for everyone in it. I go too, Habara said in a tone that ended the conversation. Hands open, stay between us, and if they raise weapons, do not answer first. The man who met them at the edge of the marsh had been his subordinate once, and had the good sense not to fire on instinct when he recognized the face beneath the mud and scar tissue. "Commander," he said, and Elias corrected him before the word had finished leaving the man's mouth. "Don't call me that. You were listed dead," the soldier said. "That was the point," Elias answered. "We came for the pod beacon and the body," the soldier told him, "if there was one." "So you didn't come for me," Elias said, and the sill. And said that followed was answer enough. They held the perimeter as agreed, no shots fired, no drones sent over the settlement's canopy, and Elias watched his old command file a status report into the air between them like it was the most natural thing in the world to describe a living man as a condition. Pod beacon confirmed. Subject Elias alive. Condition, injured mobile with indigenous contact. Do not attempt extraction if contact risk increases. He heard, in the flatness of that exchange, exactly how little his survival had changed about how the Directorate intended to use him. What he did not hear, not yet, was the order that came down from somewhere far above that perimeter. Continue passive survey. Mark all high-value biological structures. It was a junior officer running a routine telemetry sweep who first flagged something the survey brief had never listed. A biological signature the mission files simply called Eden, dense and strange, and radiating from the deep root structure the settlement itself had grown around. Transmit preliminary Eden telemetry. The order came back, and somewhere in a command structure Elias had spent 12 years serving without ever fully understanding. A very small, very quiet decision was made that would eventually cost more lives than every black operation he had ever run combined. He did not know it yet. He only knew that the ship left as quietly as it came, and that the quiet unsettled him more than gunfire would have. Soldiers who left without taking what they came for were soldiers who had found something bigger to come back for later. He said as much to Habara on the walk home, and she absorbed it the way she absorbed most warnings from him now, without panic, without dismissal, filing it into whatever long, patient calculus her people used to weigh danger against the daily business of living. "They are getting closer," she said finally, not about the retreating ship but about something else entirely, something Elias would not understand the full weight of for weeks yet. "That is why I brought him here," she added, and would not say more no matter how he pressed her. The soldier who had recognized him at the marsh's edge was a man named Reyes, and Elias remembered training him personally during his second year running black operations. Back when the idea of the Directorate erasing either of them had felt like paranoid fiction, rather than an inevitability written into the fine print of every contract they had ever signed. Reyes had the decency to look uncomfortable delivering the retrieval order, which was more decency than the colonel in the windowless room had bothered with, and Elias found himself almost grateful for it, in the small, strange way survivors are grateful for the smallest available kindness. "You could come with them," Reyes told him quietly, once the formal exchange had ended and the perimeter had gone as still as it was going to get. "Report it as a successful contact recovery. Nobody up the chain needs to know the details." Elias looked past him, toward the tree line where Habara waited exactly as far back as she'd promised and not one step further, and understood with a clarity that surprised him that the offer no longer tempted him at all. "I already came home," he told Reyes, and did not explain further, because there was no version of the explanation that a man still wearing the Directorate's uniform would have believed. He spent the walk back turning the encounter over from every angle a decade of tactical training had taught him to consider. A retrieval team that left without its objective was not a team that had given up. It was a team recalibrating, and recalibration from an organization like the Directorate rarely meant reconsideration. It meant reconnaissance. He said as much to Habara, who absorbed the warning the way she absorbed most things now, without panic and without dismissal, filing it into whatever long, careful calculus her people used to weigh danger against the ordinary business of living another day. What worried him more than the retreat itself was the particular phrase the junior officer had used over the comm channel before the ship broke orbit, a designation he did not recognize from any survey classification he had ever been trained on. Eden, he turned the word over for days afterward, the way a soldier turns over any word he does not yet understand but instinctively knows will matter later. And he was right too, though the shape of exactly how much it would matter was still, mercifully, hidden from him a little while longer. Elias spent the days after the retrieval ship's departure teaching himself to read his old command silence the same way he had once read enemy silence in a dozen black-file theaters, because a directorate that had gone quiet was rarely a directorate that had lost interest. He began, without fully admitting it to himself at first, to think less like a rescued man waiting to be rescued again, and more like a soldier assessing a perimeter he now had every intention of defending. He walked the settlement's outer boundary with Doran, who tolerated his presence on these walks more easily than he tolerated it anywhere else, perhaps because a shared perimeter was a language soldiers understood regardless of which sky they had originally fallen from. Neither man spoke much on those walks. It was, Elias came to realize, its own kind of conversation. He thought often, in the days that followed, about what Reyes had risked simply by leaving that comm relay behind without reporting it. A single quiet act of defiance from a man still bound by an oath Elias himself, no longer recognized as worth anything. It told him something he had not fully let himself believe until that moment, that the rot he had encountered in that windowless room was not universal, that somewhere inside the Directorate's chain of command, there were still people who understood the difference between duty and obedience, even if too few of them yet had the standing to act on it. He did not know, then, whether that mattered. He would find out eventually that it mattered more than almost anything else that happened in the weeks that followed. 300 light-years away, in a room that had never once been touched by weather or consequence, the preliminary Eden sample cleared containment, and the two men reviewing its data forgot, briefly, to breathe normally. Viable, one of them said, and the other corrected him without looking up from the readout. More than viable. The tissue showed active cellular reversal markers, an age-decay delay response, and a genetic stabilization potential that no lab in 3 centuries of human medicine had ever come close to synthesizing. 3 centuries of research, and the answer had been growing in a forest the whole time, waiting for someone with the will to take it. The problem, as always, was scale. Distribution range proved unstable under broad dilution. Effective processing required a concentrated, continuing grade of extraction, which meant a supply chain, which meant infrastructure, which meant a planet that currently belonged to nobody the Directorate recognized as owning anything. Good, the senior of the two men said, when the constraint was laid out for him. Public medicine creates expectation. Expectation creates pressure. Pressure creates disorder. Then we avoid disorder, he concluded, and the decision that followed took less time than either man had spent discussing lunch that same afternoon. There is an irregularity, an aide reported partway through the briefing. Elias Vaughn is alive. Of course he is, the senior man replied without any real interest. He was always durable. Durable is not important, he added. Useful is important. When the aide reminded him that Vaughn had completed 12 restricted operations under a conditional medical incentive that technically still bound the Directorate to certain obligations, the man dismissed it with the same ease he dismissed everything that cost him nothing personally to ignore. Conditional, not guaranteed, he said. Grief makes people hear promises where there were only ever terms. The reports that followed painted a picture neither man wanted, and both men found useful anyway, organized indigenous presence, tool use, defensive coordination, a strong emotional and cultural attachment to the root structure that housed the very asset they intended to extract. One of the aides, younger and not yet fully trained out of using the wrong words in front of leadership, called it a civilization. He was corrected immediately. Unregistered bio-adversary population, the senior man said, and the correction was not merely semantic. It was the entire justification, built in 4 words, for everything that came next. The site stopped being a survey location and became an acquisition target in the same sentence. Occupation protocol was authorized. Controlled occupation, root structure kept intact. The population displaced if manageable and not exterminated unless it proved otherwise. Labor and adaptation studies flagged as a possible secondary value if any of the population survived processing intact enough to study. And Vaughn, the aide, asked because someone in the room had to. If useful, recover him, the senior man said, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. If inconvenient, erase him. A pawn that crosses the board still remains a pawn. Authorization for Eden Phase 2 was requested and granted within the same breath. An acquisition fleet ordered to deploy, orbit to be secured, surface settlements isolated, harvest teams briefed to prioritize the mother route above every other objective on the ground. Keep this off public channels, the order finished, and the man delivering it did not so much as glance toward the window. 300 light-years and one unimaginable distance removed from the forest that was about to learn exactly what kind of value the sky had decided. Dead it possessed. There is no public, he said, until we decide what survives to see it. Not everyone in the room found the decision as simple as the senior man made it sound. A younger analyst, new enough to the Eden Project that she had not yet learned which objections were survivable to voice, pointed out that 3 previous worlds flagged for controlled occupation under similar protocols had each, eventually, cost the Directorate more in suppressed resistance than the harvested resource had ever returned in profit. The senior man listened to the entire objection without interrupting, which the analyst would later understand was not a good sign. Each of those worlds, he said finally, failed because the occupying force underestimated how quickly a population could organize once it understood what was being taken from it. The correction is not caution. The correction is speed. We move before they understand the scale of what we intend, and by the time they do, the extraction infrastructure is already load-bearing enough that removing it costs more than tolerating it. He did not raise his voice once during the correction, and the analyst did not raise the objection again. Not in that room, though she carried the shape of it with her for a long time afterward, the way people carry the first moment they realize exactly what organization they have agreed to serve. The economics of it, stripped of every euphemism the briefing documents used to soften them, were simple enough that even Council Prime's harshest critics rarely disputed the underlying math. A single successfully harvested world could fund medical infrastructure across a dozen core systems for a generation, could make Council Prime's name synonymous with the kind of miracle cure that ended careers-long waiting lists and quietly buried the political cost of every method used to obtain it. Nobody in the room needed reminding that history rarely audited its miracles as thoroughly as it celebrated them. The fleet was authorized. The occupation protocol was finalized. Somewhere in the paperwork, in a line item nobody in that boardroom would ever personally read again, Elias Vaughn's name sat flagged for conditional recovery. A single human life reduced to a footnote beneath a decision that would cost considerably more than the Directorate had budgeted for. There was, buried deep in the Eden Project's classified appendices, a comparison chart that no one outside the senior briefing room was ever permitted to see, ranking every previously harvested world by resource yield against political cost, a grim ledger dressed up in the bloodless language of quarterly review. The chart's authors had learned, over 3 prior occupations, that the single greatest predictor of long-term cost was not the size of a target population, but the strength of what the briefing documents dryly termed cultural cohesion resistance, a metric that had, in every previous case, been badly underestimated until it was too late to matter. Someone had flagged this world settlement as a moderate risk on exactly that metric, based on nothing more than a handful of telemetry sweeps and a single retrieval team's incident report. The flag was noted, filed, and overridden in the same afternoon, because Council Prime had learned, across a long and largely unaccountable career, that flags raised by analysts several pay grades beneath him were rarely worth the delay it would cost to seriously consider them. Council Prime himself had not always been the man who could authorize the erasure of a world's population with the same ease he might approve a routine budget request. There had been a version of him, decades earlier, who had genuinely believed the Directorate's medical mandate justified nearly any cost, that a single generation's difficult choices would purchase enough goodwill and enough cures to be forgiven by every generation that followed. He no longer thought in those terms, not because the belief had been disproven, but because belief itself had become an inefficiency he had long since trained out of his own decision-making. What remained was only the math, clean and untroubled by the specific weight of any single life it happened to require. It was, in its own quiet way, a more complete erasure than anything the Directorate had ever done to Elias Vaughn, and Council Prime would have been the first to argue, without any apparent irony, that his was the more successful one. None of the men in that boardroom would ever fully understand what they had actually authorized when they signed off on Eden Phase 2, because none of them had ever once set foot on the ground they were so casually reclassifying. That failure of imagination, more than any tactical error the fleet commander would later be blamed for, was the true root of everything that went wrong for the Directorate in the weeks that followed. You cannot calculate the cost of a civilization's will to survive from 300 light years away, no matter how precise your instruments or how confident your projections. You can only discover it, usually too late, standing in the wreckage of a plan that assumed silence meant surrender. The acquisition fleet entered high orbit without a single warning shot fired, because it did not need one. No orbital defense detected, the fleet's sensors reported. No electromagnetic shield, no launch signatures, only dense biological interference radiating from the primary root mass below. Surface access nodes were mapped within the hour. First strike targets were confirmed within 2. Initiate sequence, the order came down. Avoid deep root penetration until the harvest teams could deploy safely behind it, because even an occupation built on erasure understood the value of preserving what it had come to steal. Elias felt the first strike before he heard it, a pressure change in the air that every year of blackfile training in his body recognized a half-second before his conscious mind caught up. He was already moving when the second impact hit, already screaming at anyone in earshot to get down, to stay low, to move toward the deep chambers, and it did him no good at all against an assault designed by people who had never once had to look their targets in the eye. Cluster after cluster of the settlement lit up under fire calibrated to disrupt without destroying, because the Directorate wanted the root structure intact more than it wanted the people living inside it to survive the process of taking it. Do not pursue individuals. The fleet's tactical channel ordered its ground teams. Break movement systems. It was, Elias understood with a soldier's cold clarity, even as he hauled a wounded stranger through the smoke. An order written by someone who had translated an entire civilization into a logistics problem. He carried who he could. He directed those he couldn't carry toward the old refuge, a chamber sealed so long ago that half the younger settlers had genuinely believed it was only a story told to frighten children into staying close to home. Habara found him there in the chaos, blood-streaked and steady in the specific way people become steady only after they've run out of room to panic. You helped them reach this place, she told him, and it did not sound like gratitude so much as an accounting. I know what made them need it, he answered, because pretending otherwise would have insulted both of them. Then help us survive what you know, she said, and led him deeper into ground that had not felt outside light in generations. She told him the story as they walked, because there was no time left to tell it any other way. Long before the Directorate's sky metal had ever touched this world, her ancestors had faced an older war, one that had nearly ended them entirely, and in their desperation they had asked the Mother Root for more than shelter. They asked it for a weapon. It worked, she said. Then it kept working, long after the war that summoned it had ended, and it saved them again and again until it forgot why it had ever been asked to. That is why it was sealed, she said. Our ancestors did not bury a weapon that day. They buried what they were afraid of becoming if they ever let themselves need it again. Your hands have taken lives, she said to him then, not as an accusation but as a hinge the entire conversation had been turning toward. Not once, he told her, and not only in panic, under command, and under the hope that it would keep his daughter alive. But that does not make the dead lighter, he added, because he had never once let himself believe it did. The door will know that, Habara said. It does not choose heroes. It only recognizes what stands in front of it. One side opens to whoever knows how to kill. The other opens only to whoever has every reason to hate and refuses, even now, to feed that hate to the thing waiting behind it. I hate what they did, he told her, but I will not give that hate to this. If it opens, he asked her, can it stop the ships? It can, she said. That was never the question, she added. The question was always what it destroys afterward. The cost of that first hour of bombardment would not be tallied fully until much later, when the settlement had breath enough left to count what it had lost. A boy barely past his naming ceremony died, shielding two younger children from a collapsing chamber wall, and an old weaver who had taught half the settlement's healers their craft did not make it to the deep chambers at all. Elias carried what he could and could not carry everything, a truth that would sit in him long after the smoke cleared, the particular helpless arithmetic of triage that black operations had trained into him and never once let him forget. He heard Doran, of all people, shouting directions through the chaos with a clarity that cut through panic better than anyone else's voice managed to, and understood, in the middle of the worst hour the settlement had faced in a generation, that whatever distrust still sat between them had been set down, at least for now, in favor of simply getting people to safety. Habara's account of the older war, as she gave it to him in fuller detail during the walk to the refuge, was not the tidy legend the elders sometimes told to children at the edge of sleep. It had cost her people nearly everything the first time. An enemy she would only ever describe as the ones before. Some earlier incursion lost to enough generations of retelling that no one alive still knew its true shape, had nearly ended the settlement entirely, driving her ancestors into exactly the kind of desperate ground where reasonable people stop asking whether a choice is wise and start asking only whether it will work. The Mother Root answered because it had always answered, she said, not out of loyalty but out of some older, stranger logic neither she nor any elder before her had ever fully understood. It gave them a guardian, and the guardian won the war so completely that the enemy never returned at all, in all the centuries since. What her ancestors buried afterward was not victory. It was the guardian itself, because a weapon that wins wars this thoroughly does not stop being dangerous simply because the war is over, and a civilization wise enough to survive that first war was wise enough to know it. They chose safety over strength, she told him, and lived long enough afterward to wonder if that had been the right choice at all. Now, walking beside a man the sky itself had dropped into their midst, she was no longer sure the question had an answer that stayed true forever. The refuge itself, once they finally reached its sealed threshold, was older than anything else Elias had encountered on this world. A chamber carved not by the Mother Root's slow, patient growth, but by hands, generations of them, working in a darkness so total that Habara lit the way with a bundle of glowing fiber rather than any torch. The walls bore markings he did not recognize and Habara did not fully explain, patterns that repeated in a rhythm too deliberate to be decoration, and too worn by touch to be merely decorative even if it once had been. This is where we remember what we chose to forget, she told him, and would not elaborate further, not that night, not with the wounded still arriving behind them, and the settlement's entire remaining population waiting to learn whether the ground beneath their feet still had anything left to give them. Somewhere in the chaos of that first bombardment, Elias made a choice he would return to in his own mind for the rest of his life, the kind of choice that black-file training never once prepared a soldier to face cleanly. He had reached the edge of the collapsing outer chamber in time to pull either the old weaver or two of her youngest apprentices free before the wall gave entirely, and there had been no version of that moment that let him save all three. He chose the apprentices because they were closer, because the calculation his training forced him toward left no room for anything except proximity and probability, and he lived with the old weaver's death in the specific silent way soldiers live with every choice a battlefield never gave them enough time to feel good about. Habara did not absolve him of it when he finally told her, days later, because she understood better than almost anyone alive, that absolution was not actually what grief like his required. She only told him what she had told him before, that grief given somewhere to go becomes a root, and let him decide in his own time where he intended to plant it. The refuge held more than markings on stone. It held, in its deepest chamber, the settlement's oldest memory of what desperation could cost a people who let it go unexamined, a lesson every generation since had been raised to respect without ever fully understanding, until the day they needed it again. Then why bring him at all? One of the other elders demanded, when Habara laid the plan bare in front of the council sheltering in the deep chamber. Because the weapon will understand him, she answered, and it may listen to you the way it has never listened to us. Elias did not wait to be asked twice. There is one more law, Habara told him before he could step forward. You cannot enter as you are. The guardian answers only to a lion. So I ask you now, in front of everyone who will have to live with the answer, will you stand with us? I spent my life being useful to the wrong people, he said. Let me stand somewhere that matters. Elias Vaughn, outsider, he said his own name into the silence like a confession because it was one. Then be counted among us, Habara answered, and the old door at the heart of the chamber did not open, not yet, because courage announced out loud had never once been enough to satisfy it. The old door does not open to courage, she warned him. Courage lies easily. Do not offer it excuses. So he gave it none. I did it, he said, and did not soften a single word of what came next. Orders moved my hands, but they were still my hands. I hate them, he continued, meaning the people who had sent him to die twice over, once in a black operation and once in a drop pod meant to be his coffin. I want them stopped, but not because I want them to suffer, because my people need to live. He looked at Habara when he said it, and he was no longer entirely certain which people he meant. Do not take my hate, she told him quietly. Take my grief instead. And remember this always, if the guardian rises only to kill, we will have already lost, no matter how many ships it burns out of the sky. The root at the center of the chamber began to move before either of them finished speaking, a slow, grinding awakening of stone and fiber that had slept longer than any living memory in the settlement could account for. It feels angry, someone whispered. No, Habara said. Why wake me? Something ancient seemed to ask, in a voice made of settling earth rather than sound. To stop them, Elias answered it before Habara could. To keep us alive. Stand for the living and nothing else. Above them, the fleet registered the structure breach within seconds and had no framework for what it was watching. It's moving, a tactical officer reported, and the order to fall back came a half-second too late for two strike craft already committed to their approach vectors. It intercepted the penetration round. Another voice reported, disbelief cutting through military discipline for just a moment. It's stone. It is moving like a combat platform, the fleet commander snapped back. Then classify it as one, and disable it without breaching the root core. An order that sounded reasonable in a briefing room, and proved almost impossible to execute against something built by an entire civilization's desperation, and buried by that same civilization's fear of what it had built. Council Prime himself patched into the tactical channel before the hour was out, and the reprimand that followed stripped whatever remained of the fleet commander's composure. 3 aircraft lost, 2 strike windows blocked, 1 penetration round wasted, all under total orbital superiority against a thing standing in the mud. The entity is intercepting close-range strikes, the commander tried to explain. It is using its own mass to shield the root zone beneath it. I did not ask you to admire it, Council Prime told him. I asked why my fighters are burning under your command. You have a fleet. You have altitude. You have strike authority, and that ground platform is still choosing the terms of this engagement instead of you. If you cannot bring down a relic that has to look up at you just to see your ships, get out of the chair. You were not placed on my flagship to explain resistance. You were placed there to end it. The strike that finally broke the Guardian came from an angle it hadn't shielded, a coordinated burst that found the seam between root mass and stone the moment the entity moved to protect the settlers sheltering behind it rather than itself. It stopped. Someone on the ground whispered, watching the ancient shape falter mid-motion. Why? A child asked, not understanding yet what she was watching. Because they are guarding us, Elias told her, his voice breaking in a way 12 years of black operations had never once allowed it to. Do not waste what they are holding back for us. Fire. The order came from orbit, and this time it landed clean. Even gods have material limits, someone on the fleet's command deck observed with something close to satisfaction, as the Guardian's upper structure shattered and the ancient shape folded slowly into the mud it had risen from. Resume the access operation, the order continued, already moving past the moment as though it had cost nothing. Harvest team standing by. Send them down. Below, in the smoke and the silence that followed, nobody moved for a long time. It's gone, someone finally said. They broke the Guardian and it stood for us anyway. Do not look away, Habara told the children gathered close around her, holding them steady even as her own voice shook. This is what it cost. Let none of you forget it. Not every elder in that chamber agreed to let it come to a trial at all. One of the oldest among them, a woman who had lost her own daughter to the same distant war that had first summoned the Guardian centuries before Habara was born, argued to the very last moment that waking it risked repeating a mistake her people had spent generations trying to bury deep enough that no crisis, however dire, would ever tempt them into digging it back up. We are not choosing between the Guardian and safety, Habara told her, gently but without backing down. We already lost safety the moment the ships entered orbit. We are only choosing now whether what rises to meet them remembers why it was ever asked to fight in the first place, or rises with nothing to guide it but the killing it was built for. The old woman did not concede easily, and Habara did not expect her to. But she stepped aside when the moment came, because, whatever disagreement remained between them, neither woman doubted that inaction would cost more than the risk they were about to take. The battle above the settlement, once the Guardian rose, unfolded in a register none of the fleet's pilots had trained for. A woman named Corvin, flying one of the 2 strike craft eventually lost to the Guardian's first defensive sweep, would later tell the inquiry board that nothing in her briefing had prepared her to fight something that did not seem to be fighting for territory or tactical advantage at all, only ever moving to place its own mass between the settlement and every incoming strike, absorbing damage with a patience that felt, in the moment, more unsettling than aggression ever could have. It wasn't trying to win, she said. It was trying to survive long enough to keep us from reaching what was behind it, and I have never seen anything fight like that in my life. Her testimony would later be quietly struck from the official record, because Council Prime had no interest in his fleet's own pilots describing an occupation target in terms that sounded uncomfortably close to reverence. When the Guardian finally fell, it did not fall the way anything mechanical falls, all at once and without ceremony. It folded, slowly, deliberately, The way something enormous and exhausted chooses the ground it will finally rest on. And even the fleet's own sensors recorded the moment with a strange hesitation in the data. Several full seconds of telemetry logged as unclassified structural anomaly, as though the systems reading it did not quite know how to describe what they had just watched happen either. In the hour before the council finally called for the trial at the door, Elias found himself alone with Avigara for what felt, though neither of them said it aloud, like it might be the last quiet conversation either of them got to have. She asked him, with the same fearless directness that had disarmed him on his very first day among her people, whether he was afraid. He considered lying to her, the way adults so often lie to children about fear, and found he no longer had it in him to do that to her specifically. Yes, he admitted. She nodded, as though that were the only acceptable answer, and told him that Habara always said fear was only dangerous when it made your hand tight, the same lesson he had first heard delirious and bleeding on his first day in this forest. And he understood, hearing it now from a child instead of a healer, exactly how deeply that single idea had rooted itself into everything this civilization believed about survival. The chamber that housed the door itself was unlike anything else in the settlement, older even than the refuge, its walls grown from root fiber so dense and dark it seemed to swallow the glow of the settlement's light rather than reflect it. Elias felt the weight of the place before he understood why, a pressure not unlike the one that had warned him of the first bombing run, except this one carried no threat in it, only judgment, ancient and patient and entirely uninterested in whether he was ready for it. Habara stood beside him at the threshold and said nothing further, because there was nothing left to say that the door itself would not decide on its own terms. Whatever passed between Elias and the door in the moments before the guardian rose was never fully described to anyone else afterward, not even to Habara, who did not ask, and not to the elders, who understood better than most that some thresholds were not meant to be narrated second-hand. He would say, much later, only that it did not feel like judgment in the way he had feared it would. It felt like recognition, the specific, unsettling sensation of being seen completely by something that had no interest in flattering him and no interest in condemning him either, only in knowing, with total clarity, exactly what stood in front of it before deciding whether to answer. Nobody who witnessed the Guardians' first rising ever fully agreed afterward on exactly what they had seen, whether stone or root or something older than either, and perhaps that disagreement was itself the truest measure of how far beyond ordinary understanding the entire day had gone. "Not yet, my children," Habara whispered into the wreckage, so quietly that only Elias standing beside her heard it. "There is still breath in you. Listen." She said a name into the ruined mass of stone and root that no translator implant had ever recorded, and for a long-held moment nothing in the smoke answered her at all. "Elias," she said again, this time to him. "I'm here," he told her. "I found you." "I know," she answered. "The mother root is awake. The forest is giving us a path." "Then we strike the source," someone on the fleet's tactical channel said, mistaking the tremor rippling through the ground for a final death throw rather than what it actually was. "Control, target is still moving," a sensor operator reported, confusion sharpening into alarm within seconds. "Negative," another voice cut in. "It's not airborne, it's climbing." Missiles fired to finish it were intercepted by roots that erupted from the canopy floor faster than any targeting system could compensate for. "What in hell is it doing?" someone demanded, and got no answer that made sense until the entity broke through the cloud layer itself, climbing toward orbit on a structure that should not have been able to move, let alone ascend, let alone survive the ascent long enough to matter. "It's not coming after us," a controller finally realized, watching the trajectory resolve on his display with something close to horror. "It's going for something above the clouds. Stabilize the core," the fleet commander ordered, too late, as the Guardian drove itself directly into the fleet's forward line with the patient, unstoppable weight of something that had spent centuries buried specifically, so it would never have to be summoned like this again. Elias, hold us, Habara said, gripping his arm as the ground shook beneath the settlement one final time. Open the upper roots. The canopy will be exposed. Then let it see what we choose, she said, and Elias understood, finally, completely, what she meant. He gave the order not as a soldier following a command from above, but as a man standing beside the people he had chosen to belong to. And the forest answered him the same way it had answered every request made of it since the first war that summoned this weapon into being. The skyfear stopped. It stopped all at once, the way a held breath finally releases, and for a long, disbelieving moment nobody in the settlement moved, certain the silence was only the eye of something worse. It wasn't. Above the clouds, what remained of the acquisition fleet fell back toward the edge of the system, its commander no longer arguing with Council Prime about terms of engagement because there was nothing left to argue for. Bring them home, someone finally said into the quiet, and the words meant something different to every person who heard them. She did not let go of him for a long time after that. Elias knelt in the mud with the roots still humming faintly beneath his knees, holding his daughter the way a man holds the one proof that his choices had meant something after all. "Dad, are you coming home?" she had asked him, over every silent channel and broken radio between two worlds, and he finally had an answer for her. "Dad, you came home," she said now, and he held her tighter than he had ever held anything in his life. Around them the forest exhaled. Smoke drifted low over the canopy where the fleet had been. Above the clouds where the Guardian had climbed, there was only quiet. Habara found him there, still kneeling, still holding her, and did not need to ask if it was over. The silence in the sky told her that much. But silence was not the same as safety, and she had spent too many years of her life mistaking one for the other to make that mistake now. "They will come back," Elias said before she could. "Not soon," she answered. "Not with what they saw here today." "Soon enough," he said. "They do not leave assets behind. They catalog them. Somewhere in orbit there is already a report being written about what just happened on this ground, and men who never once set foot on this soil will decide what it means." He looked down at his daughter, at the dirt still on her face, at the small hand still gripping his sleeve as if it might have to let go of him again at any moment. "I am not leaving this time," he told her, and told Habara and told himself. "Then you will need to learn the roots," Habara said, "not as a soldier, as one of us." He nodded, and for the first time since the drop pod had torn through the atmosphere and nearly ended him, the nod did not feel like an order given or received. It felt, simply, like a choice. Far above where the smoke still curled skyward, the acquisition fleet regrouped in a silence that had nothing peaceful about it. Council Prime did not ask for a status report. He did not need one. The numbers were already in front of him, and none of them matched the numbers he had promised the board that funded Eden Phase 2 in the first place. He stared at the feed a long time before he finally spoke. "Reclassify cleaner," he said. "Not a resource site. A containment priority." And the Guardian and aide asked. "Dormant," he answered, "not destroyed. Nothing that climbs toward orbit to stop a fleet is finished simply because we stopped shooting at it. Pull every ship back to the edge of the system. I want eyes on that planet, not weapons near it. Not yet." Beneath the exposed canopy, the roots were already drawing the broken stone of the Guardian back down into the earth, the way a body slowly draws a blade out of an old scar. The forest did not celebrate what had happened there, and it did not mourn either. It simply continued, the way it always had, the way it always would, patient in a manner no fleet and no empire stationed 300 light-years away had ever learned how to be. Elias Vaughn stood at the edge of the settlement that night with his daughter finally asleep against his shoulder, and understood, for the first time in a career built entirely around following other men's definitions of victory, the actual difference between winning a war and simply surviving one. The Directorate would come back. Eden was too valuable, and men who traded lives for medicine rarely stopped chasing the trade after only one failed harvest. But this time, when they came, They would find someone standing at the door who remembered exactly what he was protecting, and exactly why. The mother root does not forget who stood for it, Habara said beside him, watching the same dark tree line he was. And neither will we. If they come again, he told her, they will not find an empty forest waiting for them. Somewhere far past that tree line, in ground that had not felt outside light in generations, something ancient shifted its weight one final time and went still, not sleeping, watching, the way it had always watched, patiently, for exactly the kind of hand it had been buried to wait for. This was only the first harvest they tried to take from this world. What the directorate decides to do next, and what wakes beneath the roots if they are foolish enough to try again, is a story for the next chapter. Subscribe now, so you do not miss the moment they come back. They buried the boy who had died shielding the youngest of the settlement's children 3 days after the fleet withdrew, in a clearing near the old refuge that had never been used for mourning before, because the settlement had never lost so many in a single day before either. Elias stood at the edge of that gathering rather than at its center, unsure whether he had earned the right to grieve alongside people who had known the boy his entire short life, until Avagara took his hand without asking and pulled him forward anyway. Habara spoke for the dead the way she spoke for most things, without embellishment, without the kind of grand language that turns grief into performance. He stood where he was needed, she said simply, and that was the whole of it, and somehow it was enough. Elias thought, listening, that it was the truest epitaph he had ever heard given to anyone, in 12 years of watching soldiers buried under considerably more ceremony and considerably less honesty. His daughter's voice found him again that same week, patched through on a battered comm relay Reyes had left behind at the marsh's edge without ever officially reporting that he had. A small act of quiet defiance from a man who had decided, in his own way, that some orders were not worth the obedience they demanded. "Dad, are you coming home?" she asked him again, the same 4 words that had followed him through a burning descent and a war he had not expected to survive, and this time he had an answer worth giving her. "Not the way you mean," he told her, gently, because lying to her now would have undone everything the last several weeks had taught him about what honesty actually cost and what it was worth. "But I found a home, and one day, when it's safe enough, I want you to see it." She was quiet on the line for a long moment, the particular quiet of a child working out whether an answer is good news or bad news, and then she asked him if there were other kids there, and he found himself laughing for the second time since the crash, telling her yes, more than she could imagine, and every one of them had better questions than the directorate's entire officer corps combined. The council met one final time before the story of that day settled into whatever shape it would eventually be told in for generations afterward. Doran, who had fought beside Elias through the worst of the evacuation without ever once softening his guarded distance, was the one who finally spoke the words nobody else had been willing to say aloud yet. "He stood for us when he had every reason not to," Doran said, "and I do not forgive easily, and I am not certain I ever fully will. But I will stand beside him, because the forest chose to answer for him, and I have never known the mother root to answer for someone unworthy of it. It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was more than Elias had expected to earn from that particular man in a single lifetime, and he understood it as the installment Habara had once promised him it would eventually become. Somewhere far above the tree line that night, in an orbit the directorate had not fully abandoned so much as repositioned, a fleet commander stared at a report he had not yet found the courage to file in full, and understood, in the quiet privacy of his own quarters, that whatever came next for Eden Phase 2 would not be decided by men who had watched what he had watched from the ground level of a failed strike. It would be decided, as it always was, by men 300 light-years removed from the consequences, reading numbers off a feed, and reclassifying an entire living world as a containment priority instead of the conquest they had promised the board. He did not know, staring at that report, whether the distinction would matter in the end. He suspected, Somewhere in the part of himself, the directorate had never quite managed to train out of him that it should. In the seasons that followed, though the story of that single day would eventually be the part everyone outside the settlement wanted told and retold, Elias came to understand that the harder work had only just begun. Learning the roots, as Habara had promised him it would require, turned out to mean something closer to relearning his own instincts from the ground up. 12 years of blackfile training had taught him to read a battlefield in terms of threat and advantage, cover and exposure, a grammar of survival built entirely around the assumption that the world around him was either an obstacle or a weapon. The forest did not accept that grammar, and Habara had no patience for him applying it out of old habit. "You are still fighting it," she told him once, watching him instinctively brace against a root system shifting harmlessly beneath his feet during a routine planting season. "It is not fighting you. It is speaking, and you have not yet learned to stop flinching long enough to listen." He found, slowly, that he was better suited to this second kind of training than he had ever expected a man of his history to be. There was a version of himself, he realized, that had existed before the directorate ever found him grieving in that hospital waiting room, a version that had once known how to build things rather than only ever break them. And the settlement, in its own unhurried way, seemed determined to excavate that version back into being. He taught the settlement's builders what he knew of load and structure. He let Avagara and the other children teach him, in turn, everything the forest had spent generations teaching them, and found that he was, for the first time since his daughter's illness first began, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy in the ordinary, unremarkable moments of a life that did not require him to justify his own survival to anyone. The comm relay rays had left behind eventually failed, as battered equipment left in a hostile climate without maintenance always eventually does, and Elias spent the better part of a difficult week trying and failing to repair it before finally accepting what the settlement's own engineers had been gently telling him all along, that whatever came next for his daughter, for the fragile, unofficial peace they had bought at such enormous cost, would not be decided by a single working radio. It would be decided by whether the world he had chosen to belong to could still be standing, whole and unbroken, the next time the sky above it darkened with something worse than clouds. He intended, with a certainty that surprised him in its completeness, to make sure that it was. Habara often said, in the months that followed, that the forest had not chosen Elias so much as it had simply recognized what he had already become by the time he reached its door, and that the trial itself had only ever confirmed a decision he had been making, one small choice at a time, since the moment he first shielded a stranger's children from a hunting swarm he had no obligation to stand against. He was not sure he fully believed her. But he no longer doubted, standing at the edge of the settlement with his daughter's voice still fresh in his memory, and the tree line dark and watchful ahead of him, that whatever he had become was worth every cost the becoming had required.